She was auctioned off while she was still bleeding from the birth, but one rancher bought her for a reason no one could understand. Just to give her a bed and let her sleep. Texas territory, late summer, 1879. The sun beat down on the town of Calico Ridge like a hammer on an anvil. It wasn't just heat, it was a weight, pressing the dust into the air, into the lungs of every man who gathered in the town square. They were cattlemen, drifters, men whose faces were maps of hard roads and cheap whiskey. And they were all staring at the makeshift wooden stage in the center of it all. On that stage, a girl was on her knees. Her name was Isa, but no one had bothered to ask. Her feet were bare, her ankles shackled. A dress, or what was left of one, clung to her frame, tattered and stained with the rust-colored evidence of the life she'd just brought into the world. In her arms, a newborn whimpered, a tiny, red-faced bundle wrapped in nothing but a piece of the same torn cloth. A thick iron chain was bolted to the stage post, the other end looped around her ankle, where the skin was rubbed raw and bloody. She kept her head down, her world shrunk to the dusty planks beneath her knees. "Step right up, folks! Step right up!" The auctioneer's voice boomed across the square. He was a big man in a black vest, his grin as wide and unsettling as a snake's yawn. "A 2-for-1 special today. Young enough to work the fields, and she comes with a squealer to grow your legacy." A wave of cruel laughter rippled through the crowd. Someone snorted. "She's still bleeding, for God's sake." The auctioneer just chuckled, wiping sweat from his brow. "Fresh as a spring calf. Ain't every day you get to name a babe you didn't have to father." More laughter. Isa squeezed her eyes shut, pressing her lips to the infant's head. It was her only act of defiance. No tears, no pleas, just silence. "We'll start the bidding at $50, the auctioneer barked. "50 for the girl and the brat. Still breathing, still bleeding. What am I bid?" "70, a voice called out from the back. 85, another shouted, a man with a toothpick dancing in the corner of his mouth. The price climbed, each number a blow against Isa's fading strength. 100, 150, 200 from the man with the toothpick. Each bid was a nail in the coffin of whatever life she might have dreamed of. She could feel the eyes on her, stripping her down, weighing her worth in livestock and labor. The baby in her arms stirred, and she rocked him gently, a tiny, desperate motion. Then a voice cut through the noise. It wasn't loud, but it was hard as granite. 300. Silence fell over the square like a shroud. Every head turned, a sea of startled faces searching for the source. He stood at the edge of the crowd, tall and still. A wide-brimmed hat threw his face into shadow, but you could see the hard line of his jaw, clenched like a fist. His duster was worn, his boots scuffed. He looked like a nobody, until you saw his eyes. $300, he repeated, his voice carrying an unmistakable finality. The auctioneer blinked, thrown off his rhythm. "Sir, I reckon you know what you're buying here." "I heard you just fine," the stranger said, his gaze fixed on Isa. "What's your intent with the merchandise?" someone from the crowd yelled, emboldened by the strangeness of the moment. The man didn't answer them. He just started walking, his boots hitting the dusty ground with a heavy, deliberate rhythm. He stepped onto the stage, the wood groaning under his weight. He stopped in front of the auctioneer and looked down at Isa, who still hadn't lifted her head. He finally answered the man's question, his voice low but clear enough for everyone to hear. "To give her a bed. To let her sleep. That's all." A nervous murmur went through the crowd. "Hell of a price for charity," someone muttered. The stranger's head snapped toward the sound. "Anyone want to top it?" Silence. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. He just let his hand rest on the butt of the revolver at his hip. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement. "No?" he said, his voice dropping even lower. "Then shut your mouth and ring the bell." The auctioneer, sweating now, cleared his throat and slammed his gavel down. Sold! For $300 to the stranger. The man knelt. Issa flinched, expecting a rough hand, a blow. Instead, she heard the soft shink of a knife being drawn. He didn't touch her. He simply sliced through the leather tether binding the chain to her ankle. The iron links fell to the planks with a final heavy clank. He extended a hand to her. She stared at it, a calloused, sun-darkened hand. She didn't take it. "What do you want from me?" she whispered, her voice rough from disuse. "Sleep," he said, his voice steady as a rock. "Then we'll talk, like people." She looked at him for a long, breathless moment, searching his shadowed face for the trick, the lie. Seeing none, she pushed herself to her feet, her legs trembling violently. The baby whimpered against her chest. The man glanced at the child, then back at her. "You got a name?" She hesitated, the word feeling foreign on her tongue. "Issa." He nodded once. "Jack. Jack Morale." He turned and looked out at the silent, watching crowd. They were still trying to piece together what they'd just seen. Jack didn't seem to care. He placed a hand lightly on the small of her back, a touch so gentle it was almost imperceptible. "This way." And with the chain still lying warm on the planks behind her, Issa stepped down from the auction block. Barefoot, blood-streaked, but for the first time in a long time, not entirely alone. The town of Calico Ridge watched them go, a broken girl and a silent stranger, walking away from a place that traded human souls like sacks of grain. Not a single soul dared to follow them. The road to Jack Morrell's ranch was a lonely one, winding through hills of cedar and stone. The world was quiet out here, broken only by the cry of a distant coyote as twilight bled across the sky. Jack didn't say much on the ride. He'd bought a tired-looking horse and wagon in town, and Issa sat in the back, holding the baby tight, her eyes scanning every fence post, every shadow. Pain was a familiar companion, a dull ache in her feet and a fire in her legs from kneeling for hours, but she didn't make a sound. Complaining was a luxury she'd never been afforded. When they finally arrived, the ranch was just a collection of dark shapes against the deepening night sky. A modest house, a barn, and a long line of fencing that seemed to stretch into forever. Jack didn't lead her to the main house. He led her around back, past a corral, to a small, weathered cabin that stood beside the stables. It was one room, with a small stove, a cot, and a wooden cradle that looked like it had been recently repaired with mismatched nails. "This is yours," he said, his voice simple and direct as he opened the door. Issa stepped inside, moving like a cornered animal, expecting the door to slam shut behind her, a lock to click into place. But it didn't. The cot had clean sheets, a rare sight. A single neatly folded blanket lay at its edge. Embers still glowed warmly in the stove. She didn't speak. Jack set a kettle on the stove and placed a bowl of oatmeal on a small table beside the cradle. "I'll be back in the morning," he said. "You need to sleep. More than that, the child needs a mother who isn't watching shadows." He turned to go. "Wait." Her voice was a fragile thing, barely a whisper. Jack paused at the door, his back to her. She moved to the cradle and carefully laid the baby down. Then, without turning to face him, her words came out, sharp and cold as steel. "If you try to touch me," she said, her voice shaking but firm, "I will slit your throat in your sleep." There was a long pause. The only sound was the crackle of the embers in the stove. Then he nodded. "That's fair." He stepped out, closed the door gently behind him, and left her alone in the silence. The night was long and cold. Issa didn't sleep. Not really. She fed the baby with a bottle of milk Jack had left, wrapped him tighter, and then she did something she had done every night for as long as she could remember. She pulled a small, wicked-looking knife from a hidden sheath sewn into the baby's blanket and tucked it under her pillow. She listened.
for footsteps on the porch, for the sound of a key in a lock, for the sound of breathing that wasn't hers or the baby's. But nothing came, only the vast, empty silence of the Texas night. Morning arrived in a hush of gray light. The baby stirred, and Isa was instantly awake, her body tense, the knife already in her hand. Her eyes darted around the small cabin, searching for any sign of threat. And then she saw it. Resting on the edge of the cradle was a small square of white fabric. It was worn at the corners, but the thread was fine. Embroidered along the edges were tiny, delicate bluebirds. A handkerchief. It wasn't a threat. It felt like a gift. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly as she touched the soft cloth. It felt impossibly clean. A soft knock came at the door before it creaked open. Jack stood there, holding nothing but another bottle of warm milk and a small jar of mashed apples. He didn't step all the way inside. He just watched her, his expression unreadable. She watched him back, her knuckles white around the handle of the hidden knife. He nodded toward the handkerchief. "My mother made that," he said, his voice quiet. "For my baby sister. She died that winter." Isa blinked, her mind struggling to process his words. Why was he telling her this? "Why give it to me?"
she asked, her voice suspicious. Jack's gaze met hers, and for the first time, she saw something other than hardness in his eyes. It wasn't pity. It was something deeper. "Because your child deserves more than iron chains and dirt floors." She said nothing. He reached into his coat and placed a small bundle of clothes on the table. Tiny baby things, patched but clean. "I'll be back by dusk," he said, turning to leave again. "Why are you doing this?" The words burst out of her, a question she couldn't hold back any longer. Jack paused, his hand on the door. He looked back at her, at the baby, at the knife she was still trying to hide. His answer was quiet, but it hit her with the force of a physical blow. "Because no one ever asked you how you wanted to live." She stared at him, the knife under her thigh suddenly feeling heavy and useless. "And what if I don't know?" she whispered. A faint, sad smile touched the corner of his mouth. "Then I guess you start with sleep." He left, the door clicking softly shut. Isa watched him go, her heart pounding a strange, unfamiliar rhythm. She sat down on the edge of the cot, placed the sleeping baby beside her, and for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, she closed her eyes. Not all the way, not yet, but just enough for the darkness to feel a little less like a monster. The days that followed moved with the slow, unhurried pace of clouds drifting across the vast Texas sky. Isa remained a ghost, rarely venturing from the small cabin except to fetch water from the well or hang the baby's few clothes on a line Jack had strung between two posts. The ranch was a quiet place, the silence punctuated by the nicker of horses and the low whistle of Jack as he worked the pens in the distance. He never approached her unless necessary. He never pushed for answers she wasn't ready to give. But something was happening, something as quiet and persistent as a seed taking root in hard, unforgiving soil. Trust. Every morning, without fail, she would find breakfast on her doorstep. Warm bread, a piece of fruit, a pitcher of milk. He never knocked. He just left it there, a silent offering. Sometimes there would be something extra. A worn book with pressed flowers tucked between the pages. A thicker blanket for the cold nights. He never spoke more than a few words to her, but his actions were beginning to speak a language she was slowly starting to understand. The baby, whom she had started calling Samuel in the quiet of her own mind, grew stronger, his cries becoming less whimpers and more demands. And Isa, in the privacy of her small world, began to sing again. Soft, half-remembered lullabies, whispered under her breath when she was sure no one could hear. Still, she guarded her secrets. She never told Jack her full name. Why would she? A name was a handle, something for others to grab onto, to own you with. The people in town, on the rare occasions she had to go with Jack for supplies, had plenty of names for her. The auction girl, Jack's chattel, that market wench. They stared at the faint scarred ring around her ankle. They whispered behind their hands. But Jack called her something else. The first time it happened, she was drawing water from the well, the rough rope burning her palms. He was walking from the barn toward the house. "Morning, Miss Isa," he said, his voice casual as he passed. She froze, the bucket swaying precariously over the dark hole. She turned and stared at his retreating back. "What did you say?" she called out, her voice sharp with suspicion. He stopped and turned, tilting his hat back from his forehead. "Your name," he said simply. "I reckon you have one." She just stared at him, a storm of confusion and wonder swirling inside her. No one has ever said it like that before. Jack just shrugged, a simple movement of his broad shoulders. "That seems wrong." And then he turned and walked away, leaving her standing by the well with the weight of that one simple word, "Miss," settling over her like a warm blanket. 3 nights later, the peace was shattered. It wasn't the rumble of thunder that broke the evening quiet. It was the thunder of hooves. 4 riders, kicking up a storm of dust, reined in hard at the ranch gates. They were men in canvas dusters, their faces hard and familiar in the worst possible way. Isa saw them from the cabin window and her blood ran cold. She recognized one of them. He'd been at the auction, laughing, the one who had said she was still bleeding. She heard the gate slam open, heard their voices, loud and demanding. Before she could even move, Jack was stepping out of the barn. He wasn't hurrying. He was calm, deliberate, and he was holding a shotgun that looked like an extension of his arm. "Evening," the lead rider said with a sneer, his teeth stained yellow. "We're here for what's ours."
Jack's voice was low and flat. "This is private land." The man spat a brown stream of tobacco juice into the dirt. He jerked a thumb toward Isa's cabin. "She's stolen property, a missing asset from the flesh warrant registry. Took off before her paperwork cleared." "She bled through her clothes on your auction block," Jack replied, his voice dangerously quiet. "I paid for her outright. You have my money." The man laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Maybe we'll just refund your money and call it even. Send her out." Jack didn't laugh. He took a slow step forward, the shotgun held loosely at his side. "On this ranch," he said, his words clear and cold as a winter morning. "Property does not breathe. That girl has lungs. And a name." One of the other men shifted in his saddle, his hand drifting toward the gun on his hip. "You making this a legal matter, mister?" "I'm making it a human one." The silence that followed was thick and heavy, stretched taut like a wire. The lead rider stared at Jack, his eyes narrowed, trying to measure the man in front of him. Finally, he spat in the dust again. "She ain't worth it." He yanked on his reins, turning his horse with a rough jerk. The others followed, their departure as sudden as their arrival. The sound of their hoofbeats faded into the dusk, leaving only the settling dust and the ringing silence. Jack stood there for a long moment, the shotgun still ready, until he was sure they were gone. Slowly, the cabin door creaked open. Isa stepped out, Samuel held tight against her chest. "You could have been shot," she whispered, her voice trembling. Jack finally lowered the gun and looked at her. "So could you." Her arms tightened around the baby. "What if they come back? Then we'll let them remember what kind of man lives here." He paused, his gaze softening just a little. "Miss Isa," he added gently. "If you want to be called something else, I can try." She looked down at the dusty ground, then back up at him. She shook her head. No, she whispered, and the word was full of a strange new strength. It was never the name I hated, just the way it was said. And for the first time since he had bought her, she spoke her full name aloud, offering it to him like a fragile gift. Issa Loreen. Jack nodded once, a gesture of profound respect. Pleasure to meet you proper, Miss Loreen. The wind still carried the scent of dust and danger, but as the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, something warm and fragile settled over the small porch. It was the feeling of a woman beginning to believe, just for a moment, that she might actually belong somewhere. That belief was a dangerous thing. The night air turned sharp and cold, and a restless wind whispered through the eaves of the cabin. Inside, Issa was curled on the cot, Samuel nestled in the crook of her arm. Sleep, when it finally came, wasn't a refuge. It was a trap. The dream was always the same. She was back on the auction block, but it wasn't a stage. It was a floor of straw and filth. Her knees were raw, the metallic scent of her own blood thick in the air. The laughter of the crowd wasn't just sound. It was a physical force, pressing down on her. Men's voices shouted above her. Not worth the feed! Just a hole with a pulse! Boots kicked near her belly. Hands, rough and cruel, grabbed at her, pulling the child from her body before her screams had even fully formed. Then came the cold. A deep, endless cold that seeped into her bones. She woke up with a strangled sob, clutching Samuel so tightly that he let out a small, startled cry. Her thin dress was plastered to her skin with sweat. The taste of iron and fear was on her tongue. She sat bolt upright, her breath coming in ragged, desperate gasps, her heart hammering against her ribs. The small cabin felt like a cage. That's when she saw the light. Through the single small window, a soft, steady glow pushed back against the oppressive darkness. It was an oil lamp sitting on a small crate. And next to it, sitting in an old wooden chair, was Jack. He had his coat pulled over his shoulders against the chill, his hat in his lap. He wasn't looking at her cabin. He was just there, watching the darkness, standing guard. Issa's breath caught in her throat. Her voice wouldn't work, so she did the only thing she could. She pushed herself off the cot, opened the door, and stepped out onto the porch. The creak of the wood made him look up. He wasn't startled. Bad dream? He asked, his voice a low rumble in the quiet night. She couldn't answer. She just stood there, shaking. He stood up, slow and careful, as if any sudden movement might shatter the fragile peace. He picked up a tin mug from the crate beside his chair and walked toward her, his steps sure and steady on the porch planks. Figured you might need this. He held out the mug. She hesitated for a second, then took it. Her hands were trembling so badly she had to use both to hold it steady. The warmth seeped into her cold fingers. The scent rose up to meet her. Lavender, chamomile, something earthy and calming. It wasn't sweet. It was just warm. He didn't ask what the dream was about. He didn't offer empty words of comfort. He just stood there for a moment, then said, No one's going to touch you again, Isa. Not while you're under this roof. She looked up at him, her eyes shining with unshed tears. How can you promise that? She whispered. I don't promise, he said, his voice firm. I just keep watch. She took a slow sip of the tea. It was hot, but the warmth spread through her chest, chasing away some of the icy fear. Jack didn't go back to the main house. He returned to his chair, settling back into his vigil, letting the comfortable silence stretch between them. My brother and I used to watch the stars, he said after a long while, his voice soft. Before he joined the Rangers, we'd try to count 'em. Pick out the ones we thought were meant for us, like they were just waiting for us to find them. Issa didn't say anything, but she followed his gaze, tilting her head back. The sky was a vast, dark canvas, so full of stars it made the darkness itself feel alive and crowded. Which one is yours? She whispered, the question surprising even herself. Jack nodded toward the north. That one there, next to the crooked line. Been following it since I was 13. And it hasn't led you anywhere? She asked, a hint of her old bitterness creeping in. He looked away from the stars and down at her. It led me here, he said softly. She held his gaze, truly seeing him for the first time. Not as a buyer, not as a guard, but as a man. His eyes weren't kind, not in the way of soft men. They were steady. The kind of steady a person could lean on, if they ever found the courage to. She gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, then turned and stepped back into the cabin, closing the door behind her. Jack remained on the porch, a silent silhouette against the coming dawn. That night, for the first time in more years than she could count, Issa slept. It was a deep, dreamless sleep, with no screams, no nightmares, and no knife clutched in her hand. There was only the soft, rhythmic rise and fall of her child's chest beside her. And outside the cabin door, the small lamp flickered once, then held steady, its flame a tiny, defiant beacon in the vast darkness, watched over by a man who said very little, but meant everything. The morning sun crept over the horizon, painting the fields in long, golden strokes. Issa was up before the rooster, a change that had happened so gradually, she hadn't even noticed it. With Samuel wrapped snugly in a worn sling against her chest, she stepped out into the cool morning air. She no longer hid in the shadows of the cabin. She moved with a quiet purpose, like someone relearning the shape of her own life. Her days found a new rhythm, one dictated by the needs of the land, not the whims of cruel men. She learned to milk the goats, their warm bodies solid and real beneath her hands. She learned to mend a fence, the splintered wood a welcome pain compared to the memory of cold iron. She learned the smell of fresh bread cooling on the windowsill, a scent of home she'd never known. She even found herself smiling sometimes, a small secret thing, just for herself. One afternoon, Jack returned from a trip to town to find her on her hands and knees in the dirt beside the stable, patiently pulling weeds from a patch of earth she'd claimed as her own. "You don't have to work," he said, setting a heavy sack of flour on the porch. Issa looked up, wiping a smear of dirt from her brow with the back of her hand. "I don't want to sleep forever," she replied, her voice steady. Jack leaned against a porch post, watching her. There was a softness in his gaze she hadn't seen before. It wasn't pity, it was something closer to respect. "My sister's name was Laura," he said, the words sudden and quiet. Issa paused, her hands still in the dirt. The wind seemed to die down, the whole world holding its breath. "She was 12, he continued, his eyes fixed on the distant hills. "A man came through, offered my father money to take her east. Promised her schooling, a better life." Jack's jaw tightened, a muscle flexing in his cheek. "I was 18. I was supposed to look out for her, but I waited too long." Issa slowly got to her feet, letting the silence hang between them. "They sent her to one of those auction towns." Jack's voice was rough with old pain. "Like Calico Ridge. By the time I tracked her there, she was gone. No trail, no one who would talk. Just a little silver necklace she always wore, left behind in a dusty drawer like it was trash." He didn't cry. His grief was too old, too hard for tears. He just stared out at the fields, where the tall grass swayed like golden ghosts in the breeze. "I haven't said her name out loud in 5 years." Issa walked over and stood beside him on the porch. She didn't offer words of comfort. What could she say? Instead, she just stood there, a silent presence, sharing the weight of a grief that was not hers, but that she understood completely. A few days later, the quiet rhythm of the ranch was broken by a loud crash and a string of curses from the barn. Issa ran from her garden, Samuel bouncing on her hip, to to find Jack lying in a heap in the hay. A ladder lay splintered beside him. A deep, ugly gash was blooming red across his forearm. "You're supposed to be the smart one," she snapped, a surprising sharpness in her voice as she dropped to her knees beside him. "Not today," he grunted through gritted teeth. She helped him to his feet and half dragged him to the porch, forcing him to sit on the steps. "That needs stitching," she said, her voice all business. "I'll be fine." "You'll be infected," she retorted, already bustling to fetch boiled water and a clean rag. Her hands trembled for a moment as she cleaned the wound, but then they grew steady. She worked in focused silence, her brow furrowed in concentration. She threaded a needle and began to sew his skin back together, biting her lower lip with each careful stitch. Jack didn't flinch. He just watched her face, the way her long lashes cast shadows on her cheeks, the fierce determination in the set of her mouth. "You're not afraid," he said quietly. "I am," she whispered, not looking up from her work. "But not of you." When she was finished, she tied the bandage tight, her fingers brushing against his skin. She sat back on her heels, looking first at her handiwork, then at him. His shirt was damp with sweat, clinging to his chest. She could see the unsteady rise and fall of his breathing, and she knew it wasn't just from the pain. It was from the closeness, the unexpected intimacy of her touch. Slowly, tentatively, she reached out and placed her hand flat against his chest, right over his heart. She could feel its strong, steady beat beneath her palm. It was warm. It was real. "If I cannot trust men," she said, her voice barely a whisper, "I still want to trust you." Jack stared at her, his lips parted as if he wanted to speak, but couldn't find the words. Her hand remained there, a small, brave anchor, until Samuel stirred in his sling, breaking the spell. Issa stood up slowly, picked up her son, and went back into her cabin without another word. But that night, when Jack sat down for his supper, he found a small, folded piece of paper on the table beside his plate. He opened it. Inside, written in small, careful script, were just 6 words. "Thank you for not giving up." He folded the note, held it tightly in his palm, and for a long moment, he just closed his eyes. In the quiet of his lonely house, something that had been frozen for a very long time began, finally, to thaw. The wind picked up as dusk began to settle, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Jack was in the corral, tightening the reins on a new foal, when he heard it. The sound of approaching horses, not the tired plod of a lone traveler. This was heavy, purposeful. 4 horses. The man who dismounted first was different from the others who had come before. He wore a fine gray coat, expensive rings on his fingers, and a smile that didn't reach his cold, calculating eyes. He moved with an arrogant swagger, like a man who believed the world owed him whatever he wanted. "Well, hell," he drawled, his eyes scanning the homestead before landing on the cabin. "Aren't you a hard one to find?" Before Issa could even reach her door, Jack was moving, placing himself squarely between the stranger and the cabin. His stance was relaxed, but his eyes were like chips of ice. "She's not yours," Jack said, his voice flat. The man in the gray coat laughed. "Oh, but she is. By contract." He pulled a folded piece of paper from his coat pocket and waved it like a flag. "Bought and paid for at an auction, fair and square. The previous owners just misplaced her paperwork. She was bleeding from childbirth when you had her chained to a post," Jack said, his voice dropping to a low growl. "There's no fairness in that." The man sneered, his polished facade cracking. "You paid for her, didn't you, rancher? $300, I believe. Well, it turns out that auction was unsanctioned, illegal, which makes my prior claim valid, and your purchase void. The merchandise is still mine. So, you have 2 choices. You give me back my property, or you pay me what she's worth. Let's say $500.
For my trouble. Issa was standing behind the screen door now, her face a pale mask of terror. She had seen this man before. He was the one who had bought her in the first place, the one she had run from. Jack didn't even glance at the paper. He didn't blink. No. The man's smile vanished. Then I guess we'll have to settle this like men. Jack took a step forward, the dust swirling around his boots. High noon, in the town square. You bring your gun. The man's cruel smile returned, wider this time. I was hoping you'd say that. The town of Calico Ridge hadn't seen a proper duel in years, but by noon the next day, the main street was lined with silent onlookers. Doors were shut, windows were filled with curious faces. The air was thick with dust and unspoken tension. Jack stood alone in the middle of the street. The sun beat down on his bare head, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows. His hand hovered near the worn handle of his pistol. Across from him, the man in the gray coat cut a striking figure, flexing his fingers over a fancy, pearl-handled revolver. He looked confident. He looked deadly. The sheriff, a portly man with a nervous sweat on his brow, stepped into the street. On my count of 3, he shouted, his voice cracking. 1, 2. From the mouth of a dusty alleyway, Issa watched, clutching Samuel so tightly he squirmed in her arms. Her heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. 3! The 2 shots exploded almost at once, a single deafening crack that echoed off the false front buildings. The man in the gray coat cried out, a sharp, surprised sound. His shot went wide, kicking up a puff of dust 10 feet to Jack's left. Jack's did not. The bullet struck the man cleanly in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into the dirt. He screamed, clutching his arm, his pearl-handled pistol falling from his grasp. Jack didn't celebrate. He didn't gloat. He just walked forward, his movements slow and deliberate, reloading his pistol as he went. He stood over the writhing, bleeding man and said only one thing, his voice carrying in the sudden, ringing silence. Men don't buy lives, and I don't shoot to prove I can. He turned and walked away before the sheriff had even taken a step toward the wounded man. That night the strain of it all caught up with Issa. The terror, the hope, the sudden violent release. It was too much. The fever took her. She was trying to boil water for tea when the world tilted and went dark. Jack caught her just before she hit the floor. Her skin was burning hot to the touch. He carried her to her bed in the small cabin, tucked the blankets around her, and began a vigil that would last for 3 days. He didn't leave her side. When Samuel cried, Jack rocked him, murmuring soft words of comfort. When Issa moaned in her fevered sleep, he bathed her forehead with a cool, damp cloth. The ranch, the animals, the world outside that small room ceased to exist. On the 4th morning, her fever broke. Issa opened her eyes, her vision blurry. The first thing she saw was Jack, asleep in the chair beside her cot, his head slumped forward. Cradled in one arm, sleeping soundly on his chest, was Samuel. She tried to speak, but only a dry croak came out. It was enough. He stirred, his eyes blinking open. Hey there, he whispered, his voice hoarse from exhaustion. Tears welled in her eyes. Why? She whispered. Why didn't you just send me away? He looked at her, then at the baby sleeping peacefully on his chest. He blinked slowly, as if the answer was the simplest thing in the world. Because this is your home. She reached out a weak hand. He took it in his calloused fingers wrapping gently around hers. And for the first time since the auction, a true, genuine smile touched Issa's lips. Spring was late that year, the frost clinging stubbornly to the window panes long after it should have vanished. But when the warmth finally came, it came with a fierce, life-affirming strength. And so did Issa. She no longer walked with her head down. She worked the fields with her sleeves rolled high, Samuel tied firmly to her back, her laughter, rare at first, but then more frequent, carrying on the breeze. The small cabin was no longer just hers, the main house was no longer just his. They were one place, one home. One morning, as she stood by the fence, watching Samuel take wobbly steps in the grass, she looked out toward the far hills. "There are others," she said, not looking at Jack, who was sitting on the porch with his morning coffee. He didn't need to ask what she meant. She turned to face him, a new fire in her eyes. "Girls like me, with nowhere to go, still bleeding one way or another." Jack nodded slowly, a deep understanding passing between them. "What do you want to do?" "I want to open the back room," she said, her voice filled with a purpose that made her seem taller. "Fix the roof, put a stove in. For them, for us." By midsummer, the new room was ready. They had built it themselves, nailing up fresh planks, painting the walls a pale, hopeful blue. They bartered eggs for old quilts and salvaged an iron bed frame from the town dump. Word spread the way secrets do in small towns, in whispers, on the wind. And then they came. One girl arrived with a split lip and a small bundle of clothes she refused to let anyone touch. Another came barefoot in the night, clutching a Bible so tightly her knuckles were white. They were quiet at first, like frightened birds. But Issa knew what they needed. She didn't offer pity. She offered a bed. She taught them how to hold a child without fear, how to look a man in the eyes and not flinch. She gave them back their names. One morning, with a thick fog still clinging to the fields, Issa found a note pinned to the barn door. There were no words, just a name scribbled in charcoal on a scrap of paper. And beside the door, swaddled in a torn cotton blanket, was a baby. It was newborn, still pink and wailing against the cold. Issa dropped to her knees. She lifted the child, her movements slow and reverent, as if handling the most fragile thing on earth. And then, she did something no one had seen her do since the day she was bought and sold. She wept. Not tears of fear or pain, but of memory, of grief, of a profound, heartbreaking empathy. Jack came running at the sound of the cries. He stopped short when he saw her, sitting in the dirt, pressing the tiny infant to her chest, her shoulders shaking with sobs. "She was just left here," Issa whispered, looking up at him. "She smells like river clay. I think she was born yesterday." Jack knelt beside her, his large, gentle hand reaching out to steady the baby's head. Issa's red-rimmed eyes met his. "What kind of person leaves a baby outside a barn?" "The kind who was never shown any better," Jack said softly. Issa rocked the child, her movements soothing and sure. "She is going to sleep inside," she declared, her voice thick with emotion but strong as iron. "She is going to be warm." That night, the kitchen was filled with the flickering light of a single lantern. Jack stood at the sink, washing the last of the supper dishes. Issa sat at the table, a baby in each arm. One born of her blood, one born of another's sorrow. Jack dried his hands and turned to look at her. He watched for a long moment, taking in the scene, the woman he had pulled from the depths of hell, now a beacon of hope for others. "I don't have a ring," he said, his voice low and hesitant. "I don't have much land to my name." He took a step toward her. "But I have a name." Issa looked up, her heart seeming to stop in her chest. "If you ever want to use it," Jack said, his voice thick with an emotion he rarely showed, "it's yours." She blinked, and a tear traced a path through the dust on her cheek. She closed her eyes for a moment, and when she opened them again, they were clear and shining. "You don't need to give me anything," she whispered. "I want to," he said simply. Slowly, carefully, she stood, shifting the new baby to her other arm, and walked to him. She placed her free hand on his chest, over the steady beat of his heart. "I was sold once," she whispered, her voice trembling but fierce. This time I choose."
He reached up and touched her cheek, his calloused thumb gently wiping away her tear. So, he said, a small, hopeful smile finally breaking through his stoic exterior. Is that a yes? Issa nodded, a radiant smile transforming her face. I will take your name, she said. Not just to live, to build something with you. Jack's smile widened, and for the first time it truly reached his eyes. Behind them, in the warm, flickering light of the kitchen, both children slept peacefully. And in that quiet room, where there had once been only silence and survival, something new and beautiful was born. Not just safety, but a family. 2 years passed. The Moral homestead was a different place. Not bigger, but fuller, brimming with a life that was both chaotic and peaceful. The vegetable garden had expanded, its neat rows woven between makeshift playpens and clotheslines perpetually hung with small dresses and shirts. A second bunkhouse, built from old pine and salvaged promises, now stood behind the main house. A simple, hand-painted sign hung above its door. Rest here. Some women who came stayed for a few days, some for months. All of them left with something they hadn't arrived with. Their own name, spoken with respect. Inside the main house, Issa kept a journal. She wrote by lantern light after the children were asleep. The house hushed, but never truly silent. On one yellowed page, in handwriting that was now firm and confident, she wrote, "This is a place where women sleep without fear." Sometimes she would pause and look out the window at Jack in the paddock.
He was teaching their own daughter, a wild, joyful little girl they called Sparrow, how to hold the reins. Sparrow would giggle, her small boots kicking the air as Jack lifted her into the saddle. Issa would smile, a deep, contented smile, and return to her writing. It was Sparrow who found the scar one day. She was sitting in her mother's lap, her small fingers tracing the faint, discolored ridge on Issa's ankle. "What is that?" she asked, her voice full of innocent curiosity. Issa looked down. The skin was smooth, but the mark from the iron shackle had never completely faded. It was a ghost of a life that felt 1,000,000 miles away. She hesitated for only a second, then answered plainly. "That was a lock someone put on me." Sparrow frowned, her small face serious. "Why?" "Because they forgot I was a person." "That's silly," Sparrow declared with the simple, profound logic of a child. "Yes," Issa whispered, her heart aching with love for this little girl who would never know such a world. "It was." Sparrow reached up and touched her mother's cheek. "No one will lock you again, Mama." Issa kissed her daughter's hand. "No, baby. Not ever again." One crisp fall afternoon, a new girl arrived. She couldn't have been more than 17, her feet bare, a fresh bruise coloring her lip. Issa met her at the fence, her presence calm and reassuring. "You here to stay, or just to rest?" Issa asked gently. The girl glanced nervously over her shoulder, as if expecting to be followed. I don't know," she whispered. Issa smiled, a warm, welcoming smile that had healed more wounds than any medicine could. "Then stay until you do." She led the girl inside, gave her a cup of warm tea, and sat with her in the quiet of the front room. She asked no questions. She offered no judgment, only warmth. That night, the girl slept for 12 straight hours. In her journal, Issa wrote, "We do not save them. We give them a place to remember who they are." Jack never asked to be called a hero, but in the quiet corners of town, that's what people started calling him. He'd just shrug it off. "I just own some land and know how to swing a hammer," he'd say. But he knew. He had built more than fences and bunkhouses. He had helped build a future. One night, he and Issa sat on the porch steps, watching Sparrow and the other children chase fireflies in the growing dusk. Jack took her hand, his rough thumb tracing circles on her soft skin. "You ever think about the auction?" he asked quietly. She nodded, her gaze fixed on the laughing children.
Not like I used to. How so? I used to hear the gavel in my sleep, she said, her voice soft. Now I hear Sparrow laughing instead. Jack turned to her, his face illuminated by the rising moon. I love you, Issa. She leaned her head against his shoulder, a perfect fit. I know. On the last page of her journal, Issa dipped her pen in the ink one last time. I was once bought for less than a horse, she wrote, but I was loved like a human. And in the end, that is the only price that ever mattered. She closed the book and placed it on the shelf. Outside, Sparrow was calling for a bedtime story. The homestead, glowing with the soft golden light of evening, waited for no one, but welcomed everyone. In the Old West, not every hero rode in with a badge or a bullet. Sometimes they just gave a woman a bed and the safety to dream again. Some love stories don't start with a kiss. They start with an act of mercy. If this story touched your heart, don't ride off into the sunset just yet. Hit that subscribe button and join our posse for more unforgettable tales of redemption, courage, and the kind of love that can rise from the dust of a lawless land. Because out here, love isn't always loud, but when it's real, it saves your soul.